During the flight, the captain suddenly attacked a passenger, trying to strangle him. But no one expected that passenger to be Chuck Norris. What happened next shocked the entire cabin. Subscribe and write in the comments. Where are you watching this video from? The jet cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet, a gleaming silver arrow carving its path through the endless sky. Inside the cabin, silence reigned, broken only by the muted hum of the engines and the occasional clink of glassware. First class was wrapped in its usual cocoon of luxury. Soft leather seats reclined with effortless grace. Polished wood panels reflected the low golden light, and discreet music flowed through the speakers, barely louder than a whisper. For most of the passengers, it was the very picture of serenity, the kind of experience they had paid thousands for. Charles Chuck Norris sat by the window in the second row. He wore a simple dark jacket, nothing flashy, and dark aviator glasses that hid the steady blue steel of his eyes. To anyone glancing his way, he looked like another business traveler, perhaps a retired executive on his way across the Pacific. But those who knew, those who had ever seen his name, would never mistake him for anything ordinary. Chuck carried with him the aura of a man who had walked through storms and come out unbroken. He had seen combat, stared death in the face, and made peace with the silence that followed every battle. Tonight, he wasn't looking for any kind of battle. He had boarded the plane in Los Angeles after a week of charity events, interviews, and handshakes. The trip to Tokyo was supposed to be quiet, a chance to rest before another round of obligations. He had smiled politely to fans in the airport lounge, signed a few autographs, even endured the intrusive flash of paparazzi cameras. But once the curtain had closed on first class, he allowed himself to sink into the stillness he craved. His eyes closed briefly as he adjusted his seat. He wasn't asleep. Chuck rarely slept deeply on planes, but he was content to drift in that half-world of awareness, listening to the rhythm of the aircraft and the muted murmur of fellow travelers. Around him, the other passengers were settled in their routines. A middle-aged Japanese businessman in the aisle across leafed silently through documents. His tie loosened, his glasses sliding down his nose. Two young American tech investors whispered animatedly about a new deal, their laptops glowing faintly on the tray tables. Toward the front row sat a European diplomat, nursing a glass of Bordeaux while flipping idly through a French newspaper. Every now and then, a stewardess floated through the aisle with a practiced smile, refilling glasses or collecting plates with the elegance of ritual. It should have been the perfect picture of calm, but Chuck's instincts, honed over decades, told him that perfection was rarely more than a veil. There was something in the air, subtle but real. He noticed it in the way one of the stewardesses glanced toward the cockpit every time she passed. He saw it in the tightness of her jaw, the flicker in her eyes. He noticed how the businessman across from him, usually the picture of discipline, kept glancing at his tablet with growing concern, shaking his head slightly. Chuck leaned his own head back against the seat and allowed himself to breathe. But his senses were sharpened. He didn't need to move to see. He had trained himself long ago to notice without staring, to register without reacting. The hum of conversation around him carried details. 2 rows behind, a couple whispered about their navigation app. "It says we're off course," the man murmured, trying to keep his voice low. "We should be closer to Hawaii by now." The woman hushed him, worried about making a scene, but the words lingered in the air. Chuck filed it away. Perhaps it was nothing, a glitch in the GPS, or perhaps it was the first thread unraveling. The minutes passed. A flight attendant offered Chuck a drink, and he shook his head politely. He had no need for champagne or whiskey. Water was enough. He sipped slowly, letting the coolness anchor him. His gaze slid over the cabin again. The atmosphere was too still, too rehearsed. He had seen this kind of quiet before. The kind that wasn't born of peace but of suppressed tension. He folded his arms loosely, letting his mind wander. He thought of Tokyo, of the friends he would meet at the martial arts exhibition, of the long halls filled with banners, and the quiet reverence of tradition. He thought of how age had never dulled his will to stand tall when it mattered. But as his eyes drifted shut again, he knew that this flight would not be as uneventful as he had hoped. Something lay ahead, hidden behind the smiles of the crew and the smooth voice of the autopilot. He couldn't see it yet, but he felt it, like a pressure drop before a storm. The businessman across the aisle finally let out a frustrated sigh, pulling Chuck's attention back to the moment. He tapped angrily on his screen, muttering in Japanese. Chuck caught only fragments, but the meaning was clear enough. The plane was not exactly where it should have been. The diplomat in the front row glanced back once, his brow furrowed, then quickly returned to his paper as if trying to dismiss his unease. People were noticing, even if they didn't want to admit it. Chuck adjusted his position slightly, resting his arm on the padded rest, and allowed his breathing to slow. He would wait. He always waited. Patience had been his greatest weapon in countless encounters, and now as the engines whispered their steady lullaby, he let that patience hold him steady. A stewardess passed by again, her perfume subtle but sharp. This time she didn't smile. Her eyes darted toward the cockpit door and then back down the aisle. She moved too quickly, her composure cracking for a moment. Chuck followed the movement with his mind. Something was happening behind that reinforced door. Something the passengers were not meant to see. But the passengers were already sensing it, each in their own way. The whispers, the nervous glances, the shifting in seats, all of it built like static in the air. Chuck knew enough about fear to recognize it spreading. It wouldn't take much for the cabin to erupt if the tension snapped. He hoped it wouldn't come to that. But hope was never his only plan. Closing his eyes once more, Chuck let the rhythm of the engines carry him, even as every nerve remained alive. Somewhere ahead, beyond the curtain of calm, lay the answer to the unease gnawing at the edges of this flight, and though he hadn't yet seen it, he was ready. The captain had not spoken. The crew was restless. The course was uncertain. All the signs pointed toward a gathering storm. Chuck Norris opened his eyes, the faint reflection of the cabin lights shining in the lenses of his glasses. He exhaled once, softly. He didn't move, not yet, but deep inside he knew. This quiet flight was about to end. The quiet in first class had begun to shift, like the air before a thunderstorm. For a while it had been almost imperceptible, just the faintest ripple beneath the veneer of luxury. But now the change had weight. Chuck Norris could sense it the way an old soldier senses an ambush before the first shot is fired. Something was wrong, and the cabin was betraying it in tiny fragments. He adjusted his seat slightly, folding his hands loosely on his lap, the posture of a man at ease, though his mind was anything but. His gaze drifted across the cabin, casual on the surface, but sharp beneath the surface. The businessman across from him was no longer reading his documents. Instead, he scrolled back and forth on his tablet, muttering under his breath in Japanese. His brow furrowed deeper with each flick of the screen, and finally he whispered something that made his wife lean forward, anxious. Chuck caught only one English word, repeated like a curse. Course! The couple 2 rows back had stopped whispering about movies, and now leaned toward each other, their voices lower, eyes darting toward the windows. The young man tilted his phone, showing her something on the map application. She looked up, startled, and whispered, "That can't be right." Her words slipped into the hum of the engines, but Chuck heard them. The unease thickened when the second pilot stepped into the cabin. It was unusual, to say the least. Normally, co-pilots remained locked in their sanctum, faces glimpsed only during boarding or farewell, if at all. But here he was, a tall, thin man with shadows under his eyes, his uniform immaculate, but his demeanor frayed at the edges. He scanned the rows too quickly, eyes flicking from seat to seat with a restless energy. A stewardess met him near the curtain. Chuck watched as she leaned close, her voice urgent but hushed. The co-pilot's reply was terse, his lips pressed thin. He shook his head once, sharply, then glanced toward the cockpit door. The stewardess's eyes followed, worry etched plainly across her face before she masked it again and moved down the aisle with a tray. The co-pilot lingered a moment longer, his gaze sweeping the passengers as if memorizing them, or perhaps checking for something. When his eyes passed Chuck, there was no recognition, only the hollow stare of a man stretched too thin. Then, without another word, he turned and slipped back through the curtain, vanishing into the unseen world of the crew. Chuck sat still, but his thoughts turned over the scene. He had spent enough time in dangerous places to recognize nerves stretched to breaking. Whatever was happening behind that door, the crew knew more than they were saying, and the silence of the captain loomed larger with each passing minute. The first-class cabin was meant to feel like a sanctuary, but now it felt more like a gilded cage. Chuck shifted his gaze to the diplomat in the front row. The man had abandoned his newspaper entirely. He was staring out the window, his jaw tight, fingers drumming on the armrest in a rhythm too sharp to be idle. When the stewardess approached him with a refill, he waved her off with unusual brusqueness. Chuck didn't miss the quick look she cast back toward the cockpit again as she retreated. "Excuse me," the businessman across from Chuck finally said aloud, his voice breaking the hush. He leaned across the aisle toward a passing steward. "My navigation is showing we're not aligned with the published flight path. Could you explain?" The steward froze for half a second, too long for a professional. Then he smiled, the kind of smile painted on like makeup. "Sir, everything is under control. Please enjoy your flight." The businessman pressed. "Then why are we off course?" The steward's eyes flicked toward the cockpit door again before he repeated, "Everything is fine," in a tone that carried the exact opposite. He moved away quickly, leaving the businessman muttering. Chuck sipped his water, letting the scene unfold. He did not move, did not speak, but every sense was alive. He had seen too many operations where silence was the weapon, where people pretended nothing was wrong until it was too late. A ripple of murmurs spread down the cabin. Some passengers were pulling out their phones, comparing maps, checking times. One woman shook her head and said softly to her husband, "Why hasn't the captain spoken yet? Every other flight, they always say something after takeoff." Her husband told her to relax, but his voice lacked conviction. The diplomat in the front row finally turned in his seat, his voice low but cutting. "We are not on the path to Narita, not precisely. I've flown this route too many times to mistake it." "Please, sir," the stewardess said quickly, hurrying toward him. "We ask that you remain calm. There is no danger." But her face betrayed her. Chuck's hand tightened slightly on the armrest. Calm words paired with fearful eyes were always a dangerous mix. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, though he was not resting. He listened. The engines droned on with their steady rhythm, but the human sounds in the cabin told a story of tension building, of faith eroding. The businessman grumbled to his wife. The couple whispered behind cupped hands. The diplomat stared hard at the cockpit, lips pressed tight. The crew moved too quickly, smiles forced, gestures stiff. Chuck inhaled slowly, feeling the recycled air fill his lungs, and exhaled with control. He had no doubt now. The piece of this flight was a thin mask, and soon it would rip. The absence of the captain was no longer a curiosity, it was a warning. The hum of the engines deepened as the jet adjusted its path, tilting slightly. Drinks quivered in glasses, a faint tremor running through the cabin. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some clutching their armrests a little tighter. The stewardess appeared again, this time without a tray, her hands clasped too tightly at her waist. She passed by Chuck's row, her eyes flicking sideways for only an instant. But in that instant, he saw the truth. Fear. Chuck opened his eyes fully, the reflection of the cabin lights glinting off his lenses. He did not rise, not yet, but his resolve sharpened, like steel sliding from its sheath. He knew the moment was coming, the moment when the curtain of civility would be torn aside. And when it came, he would be ready. The unease that had settled over the first-class cabin had begun to take on a life of its own, weaving itself into every whisper, every nervous glance, every strained smile from the crew. Chuck had seen fear spread like this before, in jungles and deserts, in streets where shadows carried knives. It was never loud at first. It grew in silence, in the way people sensed danger without seeing it, in the way their bodies betrayed what their words tried to deny. And now, as the minutes stretched into an unnatural quiet, that fear was close to breaking. He had counted the small irregularities since boarding, the absence of the captain's voice over the intercom, the co-pilot's nervous sweep through the cabin, the stewardess whose smile had cracked into worry too many times, the diplomat's sharp words, ignored but never forgotten. All the threads wove together, forming a tapestry of inevitability. Something was wrong in the cockpit, and whatever it was bleeding into the cabin. Chuck knew it was only a matter of time before the truth broke through the curtain that separated the crew's world from the passengers. It happened suddenly without announcement, as the hush in the cabin grew too heavy. The cockpit door clicked and swung open, and for the first time on the flight, the captain emerged. He was taller than most expected, his presence filling the aisle before he had even taken 3 steps. His uniform was immaculate, his cap low over his brow, but there was something in his eyes that stripped away the reassuring image of command. They were empty, hollow, as though whatever soul had once guided them had been drained away. The stewardess closest to him froze in place, her hand gripping the back of a seat so tightly her knuckles turned white. The diplomat straightened in his chair, as if to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The businessman's wife reached for his hand, clutching it as the captain's gaze swept the cabin. Chuck remained still, his head tilted slightly as he studied the man. He had seen eyes like that before. They belonged not to the mad, but to those stripped of their will, their actions driven by something unnatural. His instincts sharpened, the faint trace of unease in his chest crystallizing into certainty. The captain's movements were mechanical at first, his steps deliberate, as though rehearsed. Then his gaze landed on Chuck, and something shifted. It was not recognition. There was no flicker of awareness that this was Chuck Norris, the man known for defying odds most would not dare. It was something colder, more primal, a focus like a predator locking onto prey. Passengers shifted uneasily, murmuring questions under their breath. One whispered, "Why is he out here?" Another said, "He should be in the cockpit." But the captain did not answer them. He walked straight down the aisle, ignoring the startled faces, ignoring the nervous crew. His path was set. His target was clear. When he reached Chuck's row, he stopped. For a heartbeat, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The hum of the engines grew louder in the silence. The faint rattle of a glass on a tray table, the only other sound. Then, without warning, the captain leaned down and his hand shot out, gripping Chuck by the throat with a sudden violence that shattered the thin veil of calm. Gasps erupted. A woman screamed. Phones rose into the air as passengers scrambled to record what they couldn't understand. The stewardess rushed forward, her voice breaking. "Captain, stop! What are you doing?" But the captain didn't hear, or if he did, he didn't care. His fingers tightened around Chuck's neck, the veins in his forearm standing out as he bore down with the strength of a man possessed. His face twisted not with rage but with something worse. Absence. He wasn't a man lashing out, and he was a weapon, wielded by something unseen. Chuck's head tilted slightly under the force, but his expression did not change. His sunglasses slid down the bridge of his nose, revealing the unshaken calm of his eyes. He felt the pressure, the attempt to crush his windpipe, to strip him of air. But he had endured worse and survived. Around him, the cabin dissolved into chaos. The diplomat rose halfway from his seat, shouting in French. The businessman's wife sobbed, pleading for someone to do something. A steward tried to intervene, only to be shoved back by the captain's free hand with startling force. The captain leaned closer, his grip unrelenting, and for a moment it seemed as though he might succeed. But Chuck's calm only deepened. He felt the rhythm of the man's pulse through the grip, the tension in the muscles, the imbalance in his stance. Every detail spoke to him, painting a map of vulnerabilities. He had spent his life reading men in battle, and this one was no different. Controlled or not, hollow or not, the body still had limits. With a sudden movement, Chuck shifted his weight, his hand snapping up to the captain's wrist. The grip on his throat faltered, not by strength alone, but by precision, by the application of force where it counted most. The captain grunted, his hollow eyes narrowing, but he did not release. Instead, he pressed harder, forcing Chuck back against his seat, the tray table rattling, the glass of water tipping and spilling across the floor. Passengers shrieked. One cried out, "He's killing him!" Another shouted, "Stop him!" The cabin had become a theater of panic, the air charged with fear and disbelief. But through it all, Chuck remained composed. His voice, when it came, was low, gravelly, unshaken. "Let go!" The captain's only answer was to tighten his grip. Chuck's other hand moved, swift and precise, striking at a nerve in the captain's arm. The man's body jerked involuntarily, his fingers spasming. Chuck used the moment to twist, shifting his position, breaking the leverage. The captain stumbled slightly, his mechanical precision faltering for the first time. Gasps filled the cabin as Chuck rose from his seat in one fluid motion, the captain still clinging to him, but now off balance. The two men stood locked in the narrow aisle, a silent battle of will and strength. The stewardess cried out again, her voice ragged. "Please stop, both of you!" But this was no simple altercation. This was something darker, something no flight crew manual had prepared her for. Passengers clutched their phones, some too terrified to film, others holding on as though documenting the moment might keep them safe. The diplomat shouted again, demanding answers, but his words were drowned by the sound of struggle. Chuck's eyes locked onto the captain's, reading the void behind them. Whatever drove this man, it was not madness, nor anger, nor even desperation. It was control. And if someone had gone to the lengths of turning a captain into a weapon, then this was only the beginning. The captain growled, his grip shifting to Chuck's shoulder, shoving with brute force. But Chuck absorbed it, redirecting the momentum, stepping sideways so the man's own strength drove him against the bulkhead. The impact reverberated through the cabin, a thud that silenced the screams for a heartbeat. Chuck held his ground, steady and immovable. Around him, passengers sat frozen, torn between terror and awe. He did not move to strike, not yet. He studied the man, the unnatural emptiness in his eyes, the strange focus that ignored everything but the task at hand. The stewardess stood trembling, her hands clutched together, whispering, "Please, stop, please." Chuck's voice, calm and measured, broke through the chaos. This man isn't acting of his own will. Ah, but the captain lunged again, as though the words had never been spoken. The battle was only beginning, but already the truth was clear. The quiet flight was over. The storm had arrived, and Chuck Norris was at its center. The cabin had turned into a crucible of panic and disbelief. The captain of the aircraft, the very man entrusted with the lives of hundreds, had launched himself upon a passenger like a madman. And not just any passenger. Chuck Norris stood locked in a narrow aisle, his body braced against the brute force of a man whose eyes had been hollowed out into something inhuman. To the passengers, it was chaos, impossible to reconcile with the comfort they had paid for. To Chuck, it was clarity. He knew exactly what this was. An attack. And attacks were meant to be met, not endured. The captain's hand, still trembling with mechanical strength, clutched at Chuck's jacket as he shoved forward again. "Sit down!" A voice screamed from somewhere behind, though no one dared to intervene. Chuck turned slightly, his stance rooted, and redirected the captain's push with the simplest of movements. The tall man stumbled into the seat across the aisle, his shoulder crashing against the headrest. A woman shrieked and pulled her legs up, clutching her pearls as if the gesture could shield her from the sight. "Please!" a stewardess cried, rushing forward, tears welling in her eyes. "Stop, Captain! Stop this now!" The man's face did not even flicker at the plea. He came again, surging like an automaton, his fists swinging with the precision of someone who had trained to use them, but without the hesitation that human fighters carried. His punch sliced through the air toward Chuck's face, fast, heavy, reckless in its force. Chuck shifted just enough, his head tilting to the side, his body slipping into the narrow gap between seats. His hand shot out, seizing the captain's wrist in midair. The impact absorbed and redirected. The cabin gasped as one, the sound of shock shared across dozens of throats. Chuck twisted, and the larger man's momentum carried him into the seatback. His face smacked against the leather, dazing him. Still he fought to recover, but Chuck did not let him. With a controlled step, Chuck brought his knee up into the captain's midsection, a sharp blow that drove the breath out of him in a hollow grunt. "Stay down," Chuck said, his voice steady as stone. The captain did not listen. His eyes were blank, devoid of comprehension, and he lunged again. His hand clawed for Chuck's throat, but Chuck's arm rose like a wall, blocking the strike and snapping the man's elbow back. The crack of bones strained but did not break, yet the sound was enough to make passengers cry out in horror. Phones rose higher now, trembling in hands, capturing every second of the impossible tableau. The legendary martial artist battling the very man meant to be flying their plane. Some screamed at the crew to intervene, others prayed under their breath, but no one moved. It was as though the entire cabin had been frozen by fear, and only Chuck remained alive inside it. The captain staggered, but he did not yield. His movements were not the wild thrashes of a man drunk or insane. They were focused, targeted, driven by a purpose unseen. Chuck could see it in the way his stance shifted, his weight carried forward with no regard for defense, no concern for his own pain. Whoever or whatever was driving him cared only about destruction. He struck again, a heavy swing aimed at Chuck's jaw. Chuck ducked low, his hands snapping up to strike the captain's ribs with a crushing elbow. The man groaned, but still he advanced, unwilling or unable to stop. Chuck swept his leg low, striking behind the captain's knee, and the man buckled, crashing down onto one leg. Chuck seized his collar, yanking him forward, and slammed his forehead into the seat in front. The thud echoed in the cabin like a gunshot. Passengers screamed. The diplomat shouted in French, demanding that the crew do something. The businessman cursed under his breath. A child in the back began crying hysterically, her mother covering her face, but she could not block out the sounds. "Enough!" the steward shouted, his own voice cracking. "Somebody help him!" But no one dared step into the narrow aisle where the two men struggled. Chuck, breathing steady, pulled the captain back to his feet. His eyes scanned the man's face, looking for humanity, for even a flicker of awareness. But there was none, only the cold emptiness of a puppet. "Who's pulling your strings?" Chuck muttered, his voice low enough that only the captain could hear. The man only snarled, lunging again, spittle flying from his lips. Chuck blocked, parried, redirected. Every movement was efficient, precise, refined by decades of training. There was no wasted effort, no wild flailing. Where the captain was all brute force, Chuck was calm mastery. Another swing came, and Chuck sidestepped, guiding the man into the narrow space by the lavatory door. The captain's shoulder struck metal, and he groaned, stumbling. Chuck struck once more, his fist driving into the solar plexus, collapsing the man's chest with a sharp exhale. The captain fell to one knee, gasping, his hands clutching his stomach. "Stay down," Chuck repeated, firmer this time. For the first time, the cabin dared to hope it was over. The businessman's wife let out a sob of relief. The diplomat exhaled, rubbing his temple. The stewardess clutched the seat beside her, trembling. But Chuck did not relax. His eyes stayed on the captain, knowing better than to assume. Sure enough, the man pushed himself back up, swaying, blood trickling from his lip. His eyes remained empty. He snarled through his teeth, "You can't stop me." Chuck's brow furrowed. The words were hollow, mechanical, as though spoken by someone else through him. The passengers shivered at the sound, their fear returning like a wave. The captain lunged once more, but this time his movements faltered. The precision was breaking, his body finally beginning to betray him under the punishment. Chuck caught him by the vest and drove his knee up again, harder this time, striking true into the man's core. The captain choked on his own breath, his body collapsing at last. He dropped to the floor, clutching his chest, gasping but alive. Chuck released him, standing over the fallen man with the calm of inevitability. His chest rose and fell, not from exertion, but from focus, from control. Around him, the cabin was silent again. The storm of screams and gas hushed into awe. "Stay in your seats," Chuck said evenly, his gaze sweeping the passengers. "He's finished." The stewardess stepped forward cautiously, her voice breaking. Is he dead?" Chuck shook his head. "Not dead, just reminded he's not as strong as he thought." The captain groaned weakly on the floor, his chest heaving. Chuck's eyes narrowed. Something shimmered near the man's neck, under the collar of his uniform, a small scar, raised and fresh. Chuck bent down, brushing the fabric aside, and saw it clearly. The edge of an implant, something metallic beneath the skin. His jaw tightened. This was no simple breakdown. This was no madness. This man had been turned into a weapon. The passengers began to murmur again, questions spilling like water through cracks. "What's happening? Is he sick? Why would he attack?" But Chuck ignored them. His eyes stayed fixed on the scar, on the glint of unnatural metal beneath flesh. He rose slowly, his gaze hard. This fight was not about rage or pride. It was about control. Someone had tried to use the captain to bring chaos, and Chuck knew with cold certainty that whoever had orchestrated it was not finished. The plane shuddered as turbulence rippled through the air, drinks toppling on tray tables, passengers clutching their armrests. The crew tried to calm them, but their own voices were frayed with fear. Chuck looked down at the fallen captain, then toward the sealed cockpit door. His instincts spoke louder than any words. This was not over. The battle had just begun, and the real enemy had yet to show its face. The captain lay slumped in the narrow aisle, his chest heaving, sweat glistening on his forehead. The once impeccable uniform was rumpled, his cap knocked askew, his authority broken. The passengers sat frozen, many still clutching their phones, though most no longer dared to film. Fear had been replaced by a tense silence, the kind that falls after thunder when the storm has not passed but paused. Chuck Norris stood over the man, his breathing even, his stance composed, his eyes sharp as blades. He had seen enough to understand that what had just happened was not the end of the danger, but the beginning of a darker truth. He crouched beside the captain, brushing the man's collar back. Beneath the fabric, the scar gleamed faintly under the cabin light, raised and unnatural. It wasn't just a mark, it was a cut sealed too neatly, too purposefully. At the edge of the wound, Chuck caught the glimmer of metal. He touched it lightly with a fingertip, and the captain flinched, his eyes flickering open for a moment. They were glassy, struggling to focus, but behind the haze there was something: fear, confusion, pain. "What did they do to you?" Chuck muttered, more to himself than to the fallen man. The stewardess knelt nearby, her hands trembling. "What is that?" She whispered, staring at the scar. "Not something he chose," Chuck answered grimly. He let the collar fall back into place, straightened, and glanced toward the cockpit door. His instincts burned with certainty. This was no random act of violence. Someone had turned the captain into a weapon, and weapons always came from someone pulling the trigger. The diplomat rose from his seat, his face pale but his voice sharp. "This is outrageous. We are in international airspace, and our captain has attacked a passenger. What is the airline hiding from us?" His voice grew louder, anger laced with fear. "Sit down," Chuck said evenly, his gaze cutting across the cabin. The diplomat faltered, caught off guard by the command in Chuck's tone. Chuck's voice softened, but the steel remained. "This isn't about the airline. This is bigger." The businessman leaned forward, gripping his tablet as though it could anchor him. "What do you mean, bigger? He's our pilot. If he's not himself, then who's flying this thing?" "The autopilot," Chuck replied, glancing briefly at the cockpit. "For now." A murmur of fear rippled through the passengers. A woman began to cry softly, her hand over her mouth. The couple in the back row clung to each other. The crew tried to calm them, but their own voices shook. The steward's eyes flicked between Chuck and the unconscious captain, unable to mask the panic brewing inside him. The second pilot returned at last, his face ashen as he saw his superior sprawled on the floor. He dropped to his knees, checking the captain's pulse, then his pupils. His lips tightened. "He shouldn't be awake at all. He's been different. I told them something was wrong, but they wouldn't listen." "What do you mean?" Chuck asked, his voice low but commanding. The co-pilot looked around nervously, then leaned closer. "For weeks he hasn't been himself. He came back from a medical leave with this scar on his neck, said it was minor surgery, nothing serious, but he started losing his temper, forgetting details. The airline kept him on flights because he never made mistakes in the cockpit. They didn't want questions." Chuck's jaw tightened. "They ignored the signs." The co-pilot's eyes darted toward the scar. "That's not a surgery I recognize. And when he grabbed me in the cockpit last week, I thought he was going to break me in half. I filed a report. They buried it." Passengers gasped, voices overlapping now in a rush of fear and outrage. The diplomat shouted about negligence. The businessman cursed the airline under his breath. The stewardess began to cry quietly, torn between duty and dread. Chuck raised his hand, and the noise stilled. His voice carried the weight of certainty, cutting through the chaos. This wasn't negligence. It was intentional. Someone used him. Someone wanted this flight compromised. The co-pilot stared at him. You think sabotage? Chuck's eyes swept the cabin, the frightened faces, the trembling crew. He thought of the cold emptiness in the captain's eyes, the unnatural strength, the mechanical words. He nodded once. Not think. No. The passengers recoiled as the weight of his certainty settled over them. A woman clutched her child tighter. The businessman muttered, Dear God. The diplomat, usually so composed, slumped back into his seat, his face ashen. The stewardess, her hands still trembling, whispered, Then, we were never safe, were we? Chuck looked down at the captain again, at the scar, at the faint glimmer of metal beneath flesh. No, we were never safe. The plane jolted as turbulence rippled through the air. Passengers cried out, clutching their armrests. Glasses toppled, spilling wine across tables. The co-pilot hurried toward the cockpit, his voice taut with urgency. I need to get us back on course, whatever he did before this. I have to correct it. He disappeared through the reinforced door, leaving the passengers staring after him, their nerves frayed to breaking. Chuck straightened, his shoulders broad, his presence filling the narrow space. Stay calm, he said, his voice steady. This isn't over yet, but panicking won't help you. Over? The businessman snapped, his fear twisting into anger. How can you say that? Our captain just tried to kill you. Chuck turned toward him, his gaze unshaken. Because whoever sent him won't stop with just one man. The words fell heavy, chilling the cabin. People exchanged fearful looks, their unease growing into dread. The stewardess whispered, You mean there are more? Chuck didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was answer enough. He looked once more at the scar, then toward the cockpit door, his mind working through the possibilities. He had seen this pattern before. The test strike, the probing attack, the opening move in a larger game. Whoever had turned the captain into a weapon had planned for more than one scenario, and they would not let this flight land without trying again. The passengers settled uneasily, whispering among themselves, but Chuck stood watchful, immovable. His presence anchored them, a silent promise that they were not defenseless, even as the threat grew larger by the minute. The plane steadied after the turbulence, but inside the pressure only mounted. Chuck felt it in the air, in the quickened breath of the crew, in the darting eyes of the passengers. They were waiting for the next move, and so was he. He adjusted his stance, his hands loose at his sides, his eyes never leaving the cockpit door. The storm had only shown its first lightning. The thunder was still to come, and Chuck Norris would be ready for it. The hum of the engines filled the cabin with its steady rhythm, but it no longer carried the comfort it once had. The battle in the aisle, the revelation of the scar and the implant, the sight of their captain reduced to a hollow puppet, these moments had stripped the passengers of any illusion of safety. Even though the captain now lay restrained and unconscious, the fear remained thick in the air. Every pair of eyes darted between the sealed cockpit door and the silent figure of Chuck Norris, who stood watch like a sentinel carved from stone. He had not sat back down, and he did not intend to. The co-pilot's voice had come briefly over the intercom, taut and hurried, assuring the passengers that he was in control of the aircraft, that they were correcting their course, that there was no more danger. But even his voice had betrayed cracks of fear, and the words had done little to calm the restless hearts in the cabin. The diplomat muttered curses in French under his breath, his composure shattered. The businessman clung to his wife's hand, their fingers white-knuckled. The young couple whispered prayers. Children whimpered softly against their mother's shoulders. The flight attendants moved in stiff silence, collecting toppled glasses and spilled wine, their smiles long gone. Through it all, Chuck remained the same, his breathing steady, his stance relaxed but ready, his eyes sharp. He had fought battles in jungles and deserts, in alleys and rooftops, and he recognized the pattern now. After the clash, after the revelation, there always came a second wave. The first move was never the last. Whoever had orchestrated this attempt had planned it to the detail, And so Chuck stood, waiting for the next sign, because he knew better than anyone that the enemy was never done until the field was truly clear. The minutes stretched long, the plane cutting through the dark sky toward Tokyo. Calm tried to creep back into the cabin, but it was the false kind of calm, brittle and uneasy. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, some whispering questions, others clutching their phones like lifelines. The captain groaned faintly on the floor, his restraints tight around his wrists, but his eyes still glazed, his body twitching as though something beneath his skin fought to move again. Chuck crouched once, checked the bindings, and when he straightened, he spoke low to the nearest attendant. "Don't loosen those, no matter what he says or does. Do you understand?" The stewardess nodded, her eyes wide, her voice almost inaudible. "Yes, sir." The diplomat finally raised his voice, trembling with equal parts fear and outrage. "This is a disgrace. We have been endangered by the very man meant to keep us alive. Who is responsible for this? Who allowed him to fly?" Chuck's gaze cut to him, calm and unyielding. The airline didn't do this. They hid it, yes. They ignored it. But this, he glanced down at the scar on the captain's neck. This came from someone else. Someone who knew exactly what they were creating. The businessman swallowed hard. Creating? You mean he was controlled? Like a machine? Chuck's jaw tightened, his silence confirming what words could not. A hush fell again, heavy and suffocating. Even the diplomat could find no reply. They all knew now that this flight had been more than a simple journey across the Pacific. They had been pawns in something larger, a test perhaps, or a message. And the thought chilled them more than the altitude. The hours stretched as the aircraft descended toward Japan. The cabin lights dimmed, casting long shadows across the faces of the passengers. The stewardesses whispered to each other, their voices raw, their eyes red. The businessman's wife finally wept quietly, her tears streaking her makeup. The young couple held hands tighter. Even the diplomat sat silent now. His anger burned away into resignation. Chuck finally moved, stepping down the aisle toward the cockpit. He tapped gently on the reinforced door. A moment later, the co-pilot cracked it open, his face pale, sweat shining on his temples. "Are we steady?" Chuck asked, his voice calm but carrying the weight of command. The co-pilot nodded. "We're on course. Tokyo Control is guiding us in, but..." He hesitated, his eyes flicking back toward the instruments. "They're already aware something happened. I told them as little as I could, but when we land, the authorities will be waiting, armed. They'll want answers." "Good," Chuck said simply. "Give them the captain, let them see the scar, and tell them this wasn't a man losing his mind. Tell them it was an attack." The co-pilot swallowed hard. "An attack? By who?" Chuck's eyes narrowed, his gaze drifting past the man, through the narrow window of the cockpit where the lights of Tokyo shimmered faintly in the distance. "That's the question they'll have to answer. But I know this, whoever it was, they'll try again." This wasn't just about one flight. The co-pilot's lips parted as if to reply, but Chuck stepped back, his presence ending the conversation. The door shut again, locking with a metallic click. The plane descended through the clouds, the cabin rattling as the landing gear extended. Passengers gripped their seats, bracing, whispering prayers or holding their breath. The groan of the engines deepened, the ground lights of Tokyo rushing closer. And then, with a jolt that shook glasses and rattled trays, the wheels touched down. Screams broke into gasps of relief. A sob of joy rippled from the back. The passengers clapped instinctively, a desperate release of tension. But the relief was short-lived. Even as the aircraft slowed on the runway, flashing lights appeared outside. Police vehicles, armored trucks, uniformed men with rifles, all swarming the tarmac like vultures. The passengers pressed to the windows, eyes wide with shock. The intercom crackled with the co-pilot's strained voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, remain seated. The authorities will be boarding," the diplomat muttered. "At last," his voice bitter. The cabin door opened, and uniformed officers stormed in, their weapons lowered but ready. They moved first to the restrained captain, dragging him upright. their shouts sharp in Japanese. They checked his pulse, his eyes, and when they saw the scar, their faces hardened. They barked orders, hauling him down the aisle toward the exit. One of the officers, older and clearly in charge, approached Chuck. He bowed slightly, his eyes respectful. "Mr. Norris, we apologize for this incident. We had no idea. The captain, he will be investigated. What you discovered, it changes everything." Chuck nodded once, his voice steady. "Make sure they look closely at that scar. That wasn't natural. Someone tried to use him." The officer's jaw tightened. "Then this is not only about one man." "No," Chuck said. "It never is." The officer bowed again, then turned to oversee his men. The passengers were slowly let off the plane, some sobbing, others silent, many stealing glances at Chuck as though he were both a savior and a reminder of the nightmare they had survived. When at last the cabin was nearly empty, Chuck remained seated by the window. He reached into the pocket of his jacket, pulling out nothing more dangerous than a tea bag. He asked for hot water, and when the stewardess brought it, her hands still trembling, he gave her a nod of thanks. He sat back, watching the Tokyo skyline through the oval glass, the steam of the green tea curling into the air. The news would spread within hours. Headlines would scream his name. Videos from trembling phones would go viral, showing the legendary fighter standing against an out-of-control captain at 30,000 feet. The world would know that Chuck Norris had once again stopped disaster. But as he sipped the tea, his mind was not on fame, nor on the awe of strangers. He thought of the scar. He thought of the hollow eyes, the unnatural strength, the words that had sounded less like speech and more like programming. He thought of whoever had placed that implant, of what kind of organization had the power and the will to turn a pilot into a weapon. He thought of the pattern, the certainty that this was not the end, but a beginning. Outside, Tokyo glittered in the night, alive and bright, oblivious to the storm that had nearly fallen from the sky above it. Chuck allowed the faintest smile to touch his lips, not of amusement, but of resolve. Some men wore uniforms. Some men carried badges. He carried silence and steel, and he would be ready when the next storm came. The tea steamed gently in his hand, the warmth a small comfort against the weight of what was to come. He took another sip, his eyes never leaving the horizon. Somewhere out there, unseen, the ones behind the implant would be watching. Somewhere out there, they would plan again. And when they did, Chuck Norris would be waiting. Don't leave just yet. This story is only the beginning. Smash that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. Check out the other wild stories waiting for you right here on the channel, and share this video with your friends so they can see the madness unfold too. The next twist might be even bigger than this one. Make sure you're here when it drops.